Hi, I'm Andrew Corbett and welcome to Dear Timothy, Part 4, Paul's Attitude about Women. We live at a time when this issue is what I call a hot button issue, particularly in the church as well. Our culture has become one that is often treating some of the most vulnerable people in our society, particularly women and children, with, well, shall we say, contempt and disdain. Sometimes women, not even sometimes, a lot of times, women are treated as objects. The term is they are objectified. It's a disgraceful thing for this to occur within the church. Sometimes the passage that we're going to look at in this study, where we're going to address Paul's attitude about women, is used to justify some of these attitudes that Christians, particularly Christian men, will have toward women. One of the things that we're going to do as we look at this passage, we're going to look at the background to the Greco-Roman world in the first century. We're going to consider one of the edicts of Caesar Augustus, who gave an edict defining and legislating for a certain dress standard and moral code among women, and how this actually plays into the background of what Paul is writing here to Timothy, essentially to the Ephesians. We're also going to address one of the issues that I think is really critical to understand the Bible as it was intended to be understood. This is the role of what's called hermeneutics. Hermeneutics, how we understand and interpret the Bible, particularly with a view to application. What we're going to see is this concept of the analogy of faith. The analogy of faith is simply that we don't take a verse in isolation and build an entire doctrine around that. What we do is we look at the verses that also speak to this, not so much verses, but entire passages that speak to a particular topic. The principle applies particularly to controversial or obscure verses, particularly in the New Testament, although it does certainly apply to the entire Bible. In this passage, Paul seems all hung up about what women wear and how they present themselves in public. Why was that? Was he trying to suppress women? Using the analogy of faith, that is, Scripture reveals and Scripture interprets Scripture, so when we compare Scripture with Scripture, we see that Paul's attitude about women was anything but suppression. We'll notice that in Romans chapter 16, as he's addressing householder church leaders, many of them, in fact over a dozen of them, are actually women. Their role was to lead the church that met in their home. And when you think home, don't think of 6 people around a lounge room. These householder churches were of considerable size in the Greco-Roman world. Some of these houses, the architecture which I include in the study, you'll see could accommodate several hundred people. So when Paul writes to these women and greets them and calls, in fact the first woman he identifies is Phoebe, whom he calls a minister, the same term that he applies to himself. As a minister of a church, part of her role would have been to preach and teach, and if there were men there, preach and teach men. And then he goes on and lists a whole host of other women, including Junia, whom he says was of note among the apostles. In other words, he's saying she had an apostolic ministry. As we look at this passage, this may provoke a lot of discussion about, perhaps, from women who have experienced some pretty negative attitudes sometimes from people, particularly church leaders, in their church. This study is not designed to provoke those kind of negative emotions, but I'm anticipating that may be what is drawn out. In fact, what I hope it does is it speaks both to men and to women. To men, that they might need to have a broader understanding of the biblical role of women in ministry and leadership within the local church according to the overall message of the New Testament. that when we look at some of these passages in the New Testament, we need to ask the question, is Paul addressing a local cultural context issue? In other words, did it apply to them because of their particular cultural context? And therefore, do we have to understand that the application of it might not be identical to how it was for them in the Greco-Roman world? But then how do we determine whether a verse or a passage of the New Testament applies in a broader context? And we're going to have a look at the principles involved in doing that. So it's my hope that men who perhaps have a superiority complex toward women, who treat women perhaps with a way that is not honouring Christ, will be corrected. It's also my view that those, and my hope, that those women who perhaps have felt that they don't have a place in the Church of Jesus Christ today will come to realise God gifts women with gifts that He intends them to use. We'll see, for example, that in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 21, Philip the evangelist had 4 daughters who I think he must have been very proud of, and each of them are identified as gifted prophetesses. Now, I'm not sure how a prophet can prophesy without actually speaking, without actually potentially teaching in church. And so these women presumably were expected by God to use the gift that He had given them. We see that God did give women opportunity to be preachers and teachers. We'll see that the first women the first people rather, that announced the resurrection of Christ were all women. We'll see that God has a place for women in the church, both in the first century of Paul's day, the Greco-Roman world, and in our day today. I trust that as you go through this study, it's not just going to be about an interesting Bible study that gives you head knowledge. It really is my hope that as we look at this study, a couple of things will happen. You'll appreciate perhaps a broader aspect of Paul's attitude toward women, because I think many people have the idea that Paul was a bit of a misogynist, and I want to correct that. And I'm not trying to make Scripture say anything that it doesn't say. Secondly, I hope that we will all come to realise that God has a place for those whom He gifts and calls into ministry, whether they're men or whether they're women. And having said that, I'm not going to try and make Scripture say what I want it to say. In fact, I'm going to point out that there are 2 biblical approaches to this issue of the distinctive roles of men and women in the church. We'll see that there's the complementarian view and there's the egalitarian view. And both views can be supported by Scripture, and both views can regard that God has a place for men and a place for women, and He uses them, not just the gifts that He gives them, but He uses their experience, their background, and even their gender to fulfill His ministry that He's given them. I trust that this study is enriching, enlightening, and inspiring. God bless you.